Isaiah chapter 58, verse 10 and 11. If you give yourself to the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then you will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. What a wonderful scripture, but are they just empty words? For years the church has talked and shared the gospel, but with little fruitful evidence of Christ's transforming power to set the poor free from every yoke. Farming God's way is the gospel of Jesus Christ with boots on. It's a gospel of both word and deed. And it is at the well-watered garden that we get down and dirty, humbling ourselves and practically serving and equipping the poor to come out of poverty. So let's do just that. Well-watered gardens are 6x6 demonstration gardens which allow for the training and discipleship of farmers in their own communities. Although they are so small, they are still large enough to train farmers how to implement Farming God's Way techniques successfully on their own large farms. They take 2 to 3 hours to complete and are very cost-effective models. Whole communities gather around these well-watered gardens, not only at planting time, but throughout the cropping cycle. So farmers can learn the step-by-step procedures from whole preparation, fertilization, planting, top dressing, weeding, and even harvesting. I encourage you to make the well-watered garden experience fun by using competitions and drama, and give the farmers lots of opportunities to get hands-on experience. The best time to put in your well-watered gardens is long before the rainy season, so that farmers can adopt what they have learnt and still have sufficient time to prepare their fields in the same way. For example, in an area where planting is done at the end of November, which is typical in the summer rainfall regions of Southern Africa, ideally put in your well-watered gardens in August and September, leaving the farmers with 2 to 3 months to prepare their lands so that they will be ready for planting on time. If you are living nearby to the community you are serving, you have a great advantage. Break the teaching into sections and then get your group of farmers to complete each section before they get their next bite-sized chunk of training. Well-watered gardens are great opportunities for the preaching of the gospel. So remember to integrate the word into your teaching at frequent intervals by using parables and stories, just like Jesus did, which will reflect the gospel applied to life. Like springs of water whose waters never fail, be committed to serve the poor faithfully, repeating the training for several years. We feel very strongly about this commitment, which establishes a relational platform on which to build and also brings the community adoption of Farming God's Way to account. Often I found that very few farmers are brave enough to change within the first 3 years, but thereafter the followers swell the adoption rate significantly. So don't give up loving and serving, not in your first, second, third, fourth, or even in your 5th year. In some communities, I've noticed slower rates of adoption, and yet through perseverance and wholehearted, committed service, suddenly God gives the breakthrough. For His breakthrough, He needs your commitment. Here are some pointers to help you choose the best well-watered garden site. Choose a prominent and accessible place where the whole community can see what you're doing. Remember, you'll be planting at the same site for many years, so select the correct site right from the start. Jesus said in Matthew 5 verse 14, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all that are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Good sites are at the entrances to community centers, churches, orphanages, schools, or at crossroads. Make sure you have a large enough area before you start, preferably about 10 by 10 meters. Square it off with existing structure. We chose to square it off with this fence line that runs up this property. Then fence it in to protect it from animals by using living fences or thorn branches. The actual garden size is only 6 by 6 meters, but we want to allow enough room for people to be able to come for training within the fenced area. Shade drastically reduces crop yield, so ensure that the site you choose has no shade throughout the day. Because well-watered gardens are planted before the rains, choose a site which is close to water so that the garden can be watered by hand up until the time that the rains come. Then choose a faithful steward to be your site manager who is close at hand to care for the garden. Remember, we want well-watered gardens to be a light in the darkness. So do everything at your well-watered garden to a high standard that will give God glory. Terrain ropes are marker ropes which allow you to do farming God's way to very high standards. In order to make a terrain rope, you need a rope of some form. You can use grass ropes made in the local communities, or nylon ropes that are non-stretch, or for those of you making well-watered gardens, use a cable because sometimes they do get chopped. Next thing you need is a 60 centimeter marker stick. Cut this exactly right and use that as your marker to establish your markers on the terrain rope itself. You can use indicators on the rope such as bottle tops or small pieces of plastic which you tie on to the rope itself. So let me show you how to make this one on this nylon rope. Tie a loop on the one end, hook it on a stick, one side of the field, and just 60 centimeters away from that first stick, put your first marker on and crimp it on. Simply go down 60 centimeters from the center part of that marker and crimp on your second bottle top. Again, move down 60 centimeters and crimp on your next bottle top. If you do this rope right from the start, it will be able to be used for many, many years. So choose a good one, buy the best one you can afford, and it will stand you in good stead to keep the standards up.
What you need to take with you: a 7.2 meter terrain rope with 60 centimeter markers. I'll explain why it is not a 6 meter rope shortly. Then you need a 6 meter terrain rope with 75 centimeter markers on it. You need 4 permanent pegs, 25 4-inch nails, 3 5 milliliter teaspoons, 3 12 milliliter tablespoons, 3 350 ml cups or tins, 1 cup of good quality maize seed, about 350 seeds, 1 cup of good quality bean seed, about 180 seeds, 1 kg of lime, 2 kgs of compound D, DAP or NPK 232. If you are training in an area where the farmers don't use fertilizer, you still should have a little on hand to demonstrate a few holes. Then 1 kilogram of top dressing, example ammonium nitrate or urea. The following items I find you can usually get on site: 5 hoes, 1 50 kg bag of manure, a large heap of God's blanket, which is a mulch layer that lies on the surface of the ground, made up of plant material such as leaves, thatch grass or maize stalks, and about 200 liters of water.
It's really important to lay out your garden before the time. Sometimes when you come to a well-watered garden site, you've got hundreds of people sitting around you under a lot of time pressure. When they start seeing you laying this cable and that cable and putting nails in the ground and marker holes on the side, they get totally confused and they think they can't do farming God's way. We have to remember that this well-watered garden is simply a demonstration for the poor to implement farming God's way on their fields. Clear out any weeds in the garden by cutting them off at the surface and pull up any creeping grasses as best you can. Then try to get your well-watered garden to be as level as possible. square off your garden against a fence line like this, or a building, or a pathway. Then lay your 60 centimeter terran rope, which is 7.2 meters long, across the slope on the contour, and press in your first nail. This is corner number 1. And go to the other side of your field and pull your 7.2 meter terran rope nice and tight. Get your second corner in. That establishes your permanent baseline. The next step is to run our 6 meter terran rope with 75 centimeter markers on it down the slope. So Patrick, if you can just pull that tight, I'm going to hook this loop on corner number 2. Take a piece of paper and square it off with your baseline. Patrick, if you can come a little bit more this way. Back a little bit. That's perfect. That establishes corner number 3. Once you've established corner number 3, your well-watered garden will have an L shape to it. Simply take a nail and place a marker at every one of the 75 centimeter intervals. Then ask somebody to come behind you and to mark a hole using a hoe, just for permanence, in case the nail pops out. The next step is to switch the cables. The top cable is going to go to the bottom, and this right hand side cable is going to go to the left hand side of the garden. So remove all the loops, but remember to keep the nails in place. Okay Pat, let's go to that side of the garden. And take the loop that was on corner number 1. And Patrick, let's walk this terran rope all the way down to the bottom of the garden. Okay, Patrick, will you connect up that loop onto corner number 3? And take the 2 loops from both of the terran ropes and put a nail between the 2 of them and draw them nice and tight. That way you establish a perfect square in your well-watered garden. Next, come down the line, again placing your nails as markers on the outside edge of your terran rope. Again, unhook your terran ropes and bring your 60 centimeter baseline right up to the top of the well-watered garden again. Reattach it onto corners number 1 and 2. You can now wind up your 75 centimeter terran rope and put it away. Remember, the poor only need a 60 centimeter terran rope as long as they're filled. If you lay your well-watered garden out like we've just shown you, you'll be able to plant in exactly the same planting stations year after year for as long as you choose to serve that community. You are now ready to teach farming God's way at your well-watered garden site. Enjoy yourself.
A small-scale farmer kit for a hectare would include the following: 2 to 4 hoes, sharpen the blades and repair any handles that are damaged, 60 centimeter stick for making your terrain rope, the terrain rope preferably as long as your field, up to 50 meters long, 2 75 centimeter sticks, 30 permanent pegs, 2 350 ml tins or cups, 2 8 ml cups or teaspoons, 4 12 milliliter cups or tablespoons. The inputs required for a small-scale farmer over a hectare, which is 22,222 holes, would include the following. Your maize seed, use the rule of thumb of 25 kilograms per hectare. If you're going to be using inorganic fertilizer, you need 6 bags of DAP. If you're going to be using manure, compost or anthill soil, for either of these you would need 156 bags on hand.
In the summer rainfall regions of sub-Saharan Africa, start your land preparations at the beginning of September. In Central African countries like Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania, with both long and short rains, start preparing your lands at the beginning of January for the long rain plantings. Instead of clearing enormous areas of land, rather start small and do farming God's way to a high standard. Let your available inputs that God has given you in manure, compost, anthill or fertilizer determine what land area to prepare. For example, if you have only got 150 bags of manure, don't go and prepare 2 hectares, as your total yield could be as low as 2 tons. Whereas if you had done 1 hectare to high standards, your yield could be as high as 3 to 5 tons. Here our inputs are determining our land area to be prepared. If you've got 6 bags of DAP fertilizer, then you can do 1 hectare to a very high standard. Instead of diluting your inputs, remember, rather reduce your land area. You're most likely going to be planting into an old crop land, so make sure that the previous crop has been knocked down and keep the land weed-free throughout the off-season. If your land is a jungle of weeds, simply go and hoe down the weeds at ground level and let them lie as God's blanket on the surface of the ground. Any creeping grasses, however, that are in your field must be uprooted and removed out of the field. If you can afford it, use Roundup to kill problematic creeping grasses. If you are preparing land that has never been farmed before, this soil is already in prime virgin condition, which has produced a beautiful natural vegetation for centuries without plowing or burning. So cut down the trees, de-stump and clear the bush, leaving God's blanket made up of leaves and grasses lying on the surface of the ground. Whatever you do, at all costs, do not plow the land or burn God's blanket. Level off de-stumped areas and spread God's blanket evenly over the whole field again. The forests are a part of God's awesome wonder, which we have to actively preserve. Farming God's way allows such drastic yield improvements that we lower land demand for sensitive natural forests. See, God expects us to look after and care for His creation, and by simply increasing our yields per hectare, we don't have to destroy forested areas by using slash and burn agriculture. We had a bean crop in this well-watered garden over winter time. You can still see the leftover mulch from when we planted that garden. The first thing that we have to do is we have to establish our baseline. You always establish a baseline at the top side of your field. Use an existing fence line like this and take 90 degrees off that to establish a baseline that is nice and neat and for efficiency's sake. Run your 60 centimeter terrain rope from one side of the garden to the other. It's really important to place your terrain rope across the slope on the contour. We want to slow the water running down the slope to limit soil erosion to an absolute minimum. The contour is always a level line that runs at 90 degrees to your slope. On this baseline, drive in permanent pegs so that you can guarantee that you can plant in exactly the same planting stations year after year.
Place the first permanent peg at the first marker on the 60 centimeter Terran rope. Place the second permanent peg at the last marker on the 60 centimeter Terran rope. You can use steel rods or hard wooden pegs to maintain the hole accuracy in your field. I encourage our farmers to place the next sequence of permanent pegs at every 10 to 20 rows down the slope at the first and last markers on the rope.
So why is it so important that we should plant in the same planting stations year after year? Firstly, last year's crops would not have used up all the nutrients that we put in, and so these leftover nutrients can be easily accessed by the next crop. Secondly, the soil gets softer and easier to work in that particular planting station. Thirdly, the previous crop's roots are decomposing in those holes, improving the soil fertility, leaving channels for easy root growth and for the next crop, and greatly improved water penetration as well. Fourthly, there will be less compaction in the row as feet or implements will only travel between the rows. Fifthly, there is minimal soil disturbance between the rows, reducing weed growth. Ashton, I think it's time that we plough this field, eh? Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. I was only joking, eh? Remember, with farming God's way, we do not plough. Now, take a look at this terrible soil. You thought your soil was bad. You haven't seen anything like this. This is literally dune sand. And we need a huge amount of faith to be able to plant into stuff like this. Our holes are going to be 60 by 75 centimeters apart, which will give us 22,222 holes per hectare. Holes should be about 12 centimeters wide, which is the size of a normal hoe head. Holes for manure, compost and anthill soil should be 15 centimeters deep. Holes for fertilizer should be 8 centimeters deep. We're first going to show you how to prepare your field when using manure, compost or anthill soil as your input. Now, take your hoe head and place it on the Terran rope marker, looking up the slope. Then move the blanket aside and begin to strike about 15 centimeters away from the hole, coming closer and closer and closer to your marker. This will give you a hole depth of 15 centimeters, or around about as deep as my hand. Usually takes about 5 or maybe 6 strikes. This is a large amount of soil, so be careful not to throw the soil too far down the slope, as it will interfere with the next row at 75 centimeters away. Bringing the soil heaps down the slope means that the water will be slowed down by the hole and then collected like a dam and result in a deep penetration right in the root zone of the plant. Moving the soil up the slope is really not a good idea, as the soil will be washed straight back into the hole again. Moving the soil to the side means that the water will be moving at full pace down the slope when it hits the heap, because it doesn't have the hole to slow it down. So this method will have little benefit in slowing soil movement. So stick to the downslope method. The hole profile is steep on the upslope side and more gentle on the downslope side. When you're holing out, move in an organized manner from right to left. Space yourselves out evenly across the Terran rope line so that you don't waste time leapfrogging over one another. Make sure the team dig the holes accurately at 60 centimeter intervals, exactly on the Terran rope marker. The depth of the hole should be 15 centimeters deep, and the size should be even. Once you finish your first row, then line up your 75 centimeter pre-cut stick on the edge of a piece of paper, like that. If you want It's far better to simply run a marker rope down the one side of your field and measure it up against the perfect 90 degrees. Patrick, come across a little bit more this way. Okay, that's it. Once this rope's in place, you can run your 75 centimeter stick all the way down this rope and you know you've got a perfect straight edge. It's an important step because we want to ensure that we will be able to find our same holes in our fields next season. Remember to leave your 2 permanent pegs in place at this stage. Move your 60 centimeter Terran rope down the slope to the 75 centimeter mark and then you can start the whole process all over again. It really helps if you've got 2 75 centimeter sticks and both of you work together, keeping the square as your measure for the 90 degree angle. Okay guys, let's go again. If you are going to be using fertilizer, your holes only need to be 8 centimeters deep or as long as my fingers. You would prepare your holes as demonstrated previously, but this time start digging 10 centimeters from the rope and complete in just 3 strikes. We'll do 1 line of fertilizer holes just so that you can get to see what the differences are. To summarize then, your final hole dimensions are a hoe width of 12 centimeters, a hole depth of 15 centimeters for manure, compost and anthill soil, and only 8 centimeters deep when using fertilizer. Your holes will be 60 centimeters apart with a 75 centimeter interval between the rows. We've purposely left the last 3 rows of this well-watered garden open so that we can plant green beans as a part of the rotation teaching of Farming God's Way. We advocate that each land should be divided into 3 portions. This well-watered garden demonstrated this by having 2 portions, A and B, with 3 rows of maize each, and portion C with 3 rows of beans. In year 1, land A and B will be planted to maize, and C to beans. In year 2, land A will be planted to beans, and B and C will be under maize. And in year 3, land A will be maize, land B will be beans, and land C will be maize again.
By your 4th year, you're back to the original first year allocation of maize, maize, and beans.
This gives each land a rest from the maize crop every 3 years, which allows for the breaking of disease cycles and soil fertility improvement through nitrogen fixation when rotating with legumes. Don't be deceived into believing that you will get away with growing the same crop year after year after year. You must have full persuasion to grow a third of your field to alternative crops for the rotational value, as well as helping to spread your market risk. Other legumes you can grow in your 3rd portion rotation include groundnuts, soya beans, pigeon peas, cowpeas, amongst others. But you can also grow other non-leguminous crops such as cotton for your rotation. The spacing of many crops in the row is very narrow, and so we simply cannot use a hole. Instead, we plant in a continuous furrow on the contour. Place your Terran rope at the 75 centimeter mark, but instead of digging at the 60 centimeter markers, simply cut a furrow across the slope 8 centimeters deep. All right. Okay. Okay, Ashton, we move down 75 centimeters again. Look at the work of your hands and enjoy it. Solomon wisely speaks of the joy of good, hard work, and we can enjoy this garden's beautiful matrix of in-rows, rows, and if you look carefully, you'll even see diagonals. We have brought order into chaos on a very small scale, but your field should look like this at the same stage. Look at how beautiful it looks on a large scale. Farmers should be able to lift up their heads and be proud of the work of their hands. Once you have completed digging your planting stations, count and record them. Remember, you can't manage what you don't measure. Sometimes in very dry areas like in Lesotho, you can increase your row spacings. But in most climates in African countries, this is not necessary. So stick to the 60 by 75 centimeter model. In some soil types, usually reddish in color, there is a tendency for them to be acidic. Acidic soils bind nutrients that are necessary for plant growth, making them unavailable to the plants. This causes low yields and nutrient deficiencies. Agricultural lime applications increase the soil pH, making it more neutral, which will allow for nutrients to be more easily absorbed by the roots, which in turn means higher yields for you. As an alternative to lime, you can use wood ash, and it can even be mixed into your compost piles before the time. Simply place a teaspoon of lime in the base of each hole like that. Your dosage can be made more accurate if you have a soil sample analysis done. Remember, Brian Aldreve, who did farming gardens on very large tracts of land, would only lime every 5 years in his problematic fields. So you only need to do this every few years yourself. Due to the fact that we are not plowing and God's blanket coverage is 100% over the years, the need for lime will become less and less. God has provided each farmer with a measure of talents. To some, He gave 1. To others, He gave 2 talents. And still others, He gave 5 talents. Does this story ring a bell? I hope you are being faithful with whatever God has given you. We have to learn to give, to get out of the begging bowl mentality. Our mindset must change. We can't keep on taking and taking and taking and not giving anything back. The Bible says we will reap what we sow. 0 times 0 equals 0, and 0 times 100 also equals 0. If you give nothing to even good potential soil, you'll get nothing back. In Uganda and Mozambique and Malawi, they have beautiful deep soils, and people tell me, we don't need to put any inputs in as our soil is so fertile. But when I ask, I find that they're getting ridiculously low yields. We will reap according to the measure that we sow. Every season, the crop is removing nutrients from the soil. We have to give back to ensure that these nutrients are available to the next season's crop. If you know the number of holes in your field, then you can calculate your input needs. For example, you need 350 mils per planting station when using manure. If you've got 22,222 holes, that equates to 7.7 cubic meters per hectare required. Divided by 50, It's 156 bags of manure needed per hectare. 350 mils times 99 holes for this garden gives 2/3 of a bag required. When using manure, compost or anthill soil, use a cup 350 mils or else a bowl of the same volume, and you place that in the bottom of your 15 centimeter deep holes, like this. We want to have even stands which close the canopy early, so our stands at every stage must be maintained. Place your inputs in the holes 2 rows at a time to limit traffic to every second row. You would need 156 bags of any of these inputs per hectare, which is quite a lot, but don't be discouraged. I know many farmers that are doing it and succeeding, and so can you. Compost can be made at the field, and so it does not have to be transported to the lands. See the section on making compost later in the series. Make sure you put an even amount of manure in the bottom of every planting station. You see, the worst weed in your maize field is actually, funnily enough, another maize plant. So you don't want to create an opportunity where there are any favorites. We want our canopy to be totally homogeneous, and the best way to do that is to keep the standards all the way through. Oh yeah, Ashton. The yield potential per hectare with manure is 3 to 5 tons, with compost 2 to 5 tons, and with anthill soil 1 to 3 tons. Our yield average in the continent is around 7 bags per hectare, and so we can comfortably go 10 times better using these simple, proven and available solutions. These 3 inputs all build up the soil fertility, they improve texture, structure and the soil's ability to hold moisture, and are much more preferable and cost effective to use than fertilizer. Remember, you need to keep your teaching relevant to the poor at all times. Even when you come to your alternative crop area, I really encourage you've got to put something back. So when we place our inputs in the bean row, simply apply the 350 mils in a band in the furrow. You spread it evenly, and you go to your next 60 centimeter area. Again, apply 350 mils evenly in a band. We have left this last row of holes dug to 8 centimeters deep to demonstrate how to use fertilizer. Most small-scale farmers have no access to fertilizer because of its high cost and the remoteness of their areas. But they do sometimes get given fertilizer vouchers or bags, and then should know how to use it wisely. Many African countries, the people are scared of using fertilizers, and they've been given false information. There's nothing wrong with using fertilizer, but overusing it can have a negative impact on the soil. Remember, in large-scale farming systems, it's nearly impossible to give back the volumes of nutrients removed by the crop and get very high yields. And so there is a place for fertilizer. Where Brian Aldrieve originally started farming God's Way on Hinton Estate, fertilizers have been used since 1984 with excellent results doing farming God's Way. Fertilizers come in 2 basic types. You have your basal dressings and your top dressings. The basal types include DAP or diammonium phosphate and NPK in 232 and alternative ratios. They have a balance of nutrients and are made up of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. Basal fertilizers get placed in the bottom of the holes. Top dressing types have only got nitrogen in them. They get placed on the surface of the ground and include CAN or calcium ammonium nitrate and urea. For optimal yields, place 12 mils or a tablespoon of DAP in each hole in a narrow band across the base of the hole like this. You would need 6 bags of DAP per hectare, which is quite pricey, but see the budget section later on in the series to see whether it will be worthwhile for you. The record farming God's Way yield was 13.9 tons per hectare on large scale using fertilizer. An example to calculate your fertilizer requirement is 12 milliliters times 22,222 holes. That equals 266 kilograms or 6 bags of DAP. If you are using fertilizer for your rotation crop, simply apply a heap teaspoon at every 60 centimeters like this. Remember, right at the beginning I encouraged you to prepare a land area that you would be able to give good inputs into and not to spread your inputs thinly over a large area. So if you only have a small amount of inputs, rather use what you have on a smaller area and do it to a high standard than doing a large portion to a low standard. Cover all your inputs with about 3 centimeters of soil from the soil heap. We do this to get the exact planting depth for maize, which is 5 centimeters or a matchbox long. This separation layer is also very important to separate the seed from being burnt by the inputs, especially when using fertilizer or manure. Covering also prevents the loss of nitrogen to the atmosphere. Your bean rows need a final depth of planting at 3 centimeters deep. That's a matchbox on its side. So cover leaving this depth remaining. No matter where you are in the world, try to be ready for planting at least 3 weeks before the optimal planting date in your region. This way you're sure of being on time, especially if you have good early rains. In the summer rainfall regions like South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique and Malawi, you should be ready to be able to plant, having dug your planting stations, put in your inputs and cover them slightly by the end of October, in readiness for the optimal planting date of the 10th to the 25th of November. In the Central African countries such as Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda and Uganda, the long rains dominate there and you should be ready for planting by the end of February in readiness for late March plantings. So many times in Africa I get asked, what about dry planting? Well, I really encourage you not to do this. If you dry plant and you have just enough rain for germination and then you have a dry spell again, you'll have to replant your whole garden. You must wait for sufficient rains before planting. If you're unsure about how much rain is enough, check the manual suitable for your climatic zone. As you can see, we are watering this well-watered garden and we are acting as rainfall. Can you hear the thunder and see the lightning all over the show? No, you remember, we have to water this garden because we need to teach people to complete the whole planting process. We can't wait until the rains get here, as then they won't have enough time to be able to prepare their large fields. Sure. Looks like we just finished this garden just in time. Here come the first early spring rains. I trust that you will be ready on time. Lord, we just want to come before you this morning, on this beautiful day that you've made. We thank you for the rains that fell just yesterday, Lord God. We thank you that you're pouring out your blessing upon the earth so that the seeds can sprout and bring forth a great increase. We thank you that we have this opportunity to plant today, and we just pray over the seed that it would flourish and bring in a bountiful harvest for us in Jesus' name. Thank you, Lord. Amen. We really advocate that small-scale farmers use open pollinated variety seed. They perform at much the same yield under suboptimal conditions. They are much cheaper, and the same seed can be stored at the end of every season and replanted for several years to come. Hybrid seeds, however, must be bought each year, and the poor get yoked into the seed companies' money-making schemes, or else they become seed aid dependents. The poor should be free to be able to plant whenever they're ready to plant, and not yoked to men, to governments, or organizations. If you have to buy in seed, buy the best open pollinated variety that you can afford. When you're ready to plant and have had sufficient rainfall, take the exact amount of seed you can plant at any one time and pre-soak it for 6 hours to allow the seed to take up water and to swell. Ashton, show us how to plant Zimbabwe style.
Okay.
Okay, whoa. See, I know, I've seen in your planting stations 6, 7, 8, even 12 seeds per planting station. With Farming God's Way, we've got to bend our back and do it to a high standard. With Farming God's Way, place 3 seeds per planting station neatly in the row. One on the left-hand side, one in the middle, and one on the far right-hand side of each planting station. That will give you 66,666 seeds planted per hectare. When you're planting in manure, compost or anthill holes, then you plant the seed just 2 inches or 2 matchbox widths away from the top side of the holes. When you're planting in fertilizer planting stations, then you just plant them 1 inch or 1 matchbox width away from the top side of the holes. That will ensure that when the roots grow down, they grow right in to the maximum amount of nutrients directly under the root zone. These are a part of the standards that are going to give God glory in our fields. When planting beans, place the beans at 10 centimeter intervals in the row. Now that we've planted, let's quickly cover up the holes. Ashton, show us how you do it Zimbabwe style. Okay. Huh? 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 Whoa. No. With Farming God's Way, you take fine, loose soil from the soil heap that is on the downslope side. Make sure that you don't cover with stones, heavy clods, or God's blanket. All of these can result in poor germination rates and uneven stands, so take good care at this point. Cover evenly with no depressions. These depressions can cause problems as pools of water develop here after heavy rains, and seedlings will get diseases such as damping off, as their stems will be right inside the water. We're in the Tsitsikamma rainforest in South Africa. People come from all over the world to enjoy this incredible spectacle that the Lord has created. They had a flood here recently, and this giant Otaniqua yellowwood was uprooted. It reveals two secrets about this forest. The first one is just exactly how shallow the root system is, and secondly, how poor the soil is that it's growing on. Why exactly does this forest flourish like it does? If we come to God's garden, which is anywhere where there's no intervention by man, we'll see that God, in His wisdom, puts a protective covering on the surface of the ground. This mulch is made up of leaves and twigs and fruits and decaying grasses, all which decompose gradually over many years. We call this mulch God's blanket. This forest flourishes because of the release of organic matter and nutrients from God's blanket. Just take a look at the rich, dark complexion of the soil because of this decomposition process. The reason why these massive trees have such a shallow root system is because they are feeding off the nutrients that are right at the soil's surface. God's blanket protects the soil from erosion. It allows for deep penetration of rainfall, it conserves moisture, improves soil fertility, and plants have improved drought tolerance and an ideal growing environment, amongst many others. All these lead to significantly improved yields. God's blanket is the key. We need to be aiming for 100% mulch covers on the surface of the ground, and even more. Although it may take you a few years to get to this level, you need to be fully persuaded in your heart to achieve it. In the beginning, you will find you've got leftover crop residues and some weeds to act as your blanket, so you will have to build it up. In order to do this, you can use grass cuttings, banana leaves, forest mulch, and even your neighbor's crop residues before he burns them. We're going to add to ours using these grass cuttings. Cover the whole field evenly. Yes, even over the holes. The seeds will germinate right through the blanket, so don't fear. God's blanket is so important. I cannot emphasize it enough. Nobody would simply allow a thief to walk in broad daylight and steal from their homes, would they? Why would you allow the most important aspect of your farming practice to be eaten by your neighbor's animals? We really need to see God's blanket as the treasure of the soil. Guard it and be continually building it up. Oh, Patrick! Yeah. It's been 10 days since we planted. Let's go and take a look in the garden to see exactly how things are coming along. Wow, look at these maize seedlings emerging directly through God's blanket. Emergence is an incredible display of God's creative power, where He can take a dead seed like this and make it come alive and sprout. It's a bit like our lives, you know. We were once dead in our sin, and Jesus came and He breathed His life into us, and we're now, by His grace, able to live life more abundantly. I bet there are those of you who are worried about whether these seedlings are going to emerge through this blanket. I know I was. The very first time I planted Farming God's Way style, I planted with a very thick maize stover cover, and the emergence came through with shining colors, and I just want you to be encouraged to do the same. Sometimes the emergence through God's blanket can be a little bit slower because of the reduced soil temperatures. Don't worry about that. They very soon catch up, and you've got to remember, it's not how you start, but how you finish that counts. Let's go and take a look through the rest of the garden to see how the rest of the emergence is going along. Clearly, when we come to this area, chickens or guinea fowl or rats have got in and eaten the seed out of these planting stations. We can quickly remedy this by gapping. Count the number of planting stations where there's been no emergence and multiply that by 3 to get the number of seeds that you need for the planting process. In this example, we've got 5 planting stations where there's been no emergence, so we need around about 15 seeds. Take those seeds and you pre-soak them in water for around about 6 hours so they take up moisture and they swell, and then we are ready for the gapping process. After pre-soaking the seed for 6 hours, simply place your 3 seeds per planting station where there are gaps. When you come to pressing them into the ground, you don't need to dig the planting stations all over again. Simply press them in to 5 centimeters deep to allow that seedling to germinate perfectly. And then you gently cover them over and make sure God's blanket is over that whole area. With Farming God's Way, we really don't want to have any weeds in our field. Weeds compete with our plants for water, space, light and nutrients, and they significantly reduce our crop yields.
Do your first weeding when the weeds are still small, around 3 centimeters, usually 10 to 14 days after planting. Weed backwards, simply cutting the weeds off at the soil surface, leaving them to add to God's blanket. Pull out any creeping grasses and carry them out of your field. Repeat the weeding process every 10 to 14 days.
Don't let weeds set seed in your fields. They produce hundreds of thousands of seeds, and those seeds can remain dormant in the soil for up to 20 years. Seed and sin have a lot in common. If you don't deal with the sin in your life, it can lead you to disgrace. In the same way, if you don't deal with the weeds in your field, you can have up to 7 years of problems from just one bad year of weed control. So be on time and keep your lands weed-free throughout the whole year. The Farming God's Way farmer starts weeding when the weeds are just 3 centimeters tall. It takes him 7 days to complete his whole garden, and he does it with a lot of joy. Hallelujah, Hosanna. And he finishes the whole garden, and because the weed cycle is a 10-day cycle, he has 3 days to rest. The lazy farmer, on the other hand, gets up in the morning and he looks out over the fields through his hat and he says, the weeds are still too small. Rather let them grow up and get bigger and bigger. Next day he gets up and they're still only about 10 centimeters. They're still too small. He waits for them to get 1 foot tall. He says, the weeds are worth weeding. So he starts weeding, and it's a jungle of weeds. And the harder he works, the more he loses his joy, and he starts to hate farming. 14 days later, he finishes the farm and he weeds his last bit, rejoicing that now finally his job's finished. But as he comes up the field, he sees the weeds are getting bigger and bigger every row because he's 4 days late. The weeds at the start are 4 days bigger than when he first started. Farming becomes a curse instead of a blessing. Thinning. We planted 3 seeds, but we actually only want 2 seedlings per hole. It has been shown that yields are best at 2 seedlings per hole, and that is 44,444 plants per hectare. Seed is only certified at around 87%. And so if we had planted 44,444 seeds, only about 38,000 would have come up. And that is excluding losses from rats and chickens and guinea fowl, leaving probably around 35,000 plants per hectare. So it is impossible to get our optimal yield potential unless we plant 3 seeds per hole and then we thin down to just 2. It has been proven that for every cent you spend on the 3rd seed, you will get back 40 cents through the thinning process. That is a 40 times cost to benefit ratio, so it's really worthwhile doing it. Thin at 2 to 3 weeks after emergence, when the seedlings are around 20 to 30 centimeters tall. You thin by uprooting the plant like that. It's the weakest of the 3, or if they're all the same size, then the middle plant of each hole's emerged seedlings. Look at 3 holes at a time, not at 1, as sometimes there are no emerged seedlings at one particular hole. Let's do some examples to show how thinning should be done. Over 3 planting stations, we want an average of 2 per planting station. Here we've got 1 plus 3 plus 3, that makes 7. We only want 6, so we would thin out the 3rd one of the furthest planting station to make a total of 6 plants. When we come to these 3 planting stations, we have 3 plus 3 plus 2. That's 8 plants. We only want 6. So we would thin. In this example, I would have chosen this, which looks like the weakest of those 3. And this one on the side here is the weakest of these 3. Gives you a total of 2 plus 2 plus 2, 6, exactly what we want. In this example, we've got 3, 0, and 3. So even though we gapped in this planting station, nothing came up. 3 plus 3 is 6, so that's exactly the number we want for these 3 planting stations. Do your first top dress just after thinning. Use an 8mm spoon or else a heap teaspoon. And place the ammonium nitrate 7 centimeters away from the plants on the upslope side to prevent burning the stems.
The top dressing must be placed between the seedlings to allow for even growth.
No other forms of inputs are practical as a top dressing option, except for urine. But the vast quantities required and the storage requirements prior to use prevent urine from becoming a major top dressing option. But it certainly has its place on a very small scale. Keep doing your weeding every 10 to 14 days and also building up your blanket coverage. It's really incredible to see the reduction in weed growth when you have a good blanket in place. You will most likely have to do between 2 and 3 weedings before the full canopy stage of your maize crop. Keep on weeding backwards and weed when the weeds are still very tiny. One of the great advantages of the spacing of 60 by 75 is that the canopy closes so early on, capturing the maximum amount of sunlight for good growth and also shading out weeds. At about 6 weeks, your plants are at about waist high, and so they will be able to close the canopy completely, giving you a rest from weeding for quite some time. Suckers sometimes branch from the base of the parent plant right at the ground level. Some advisors have recommended that desuckering will improve yields. However, research has shown that this is not the case. We encourage you to do desuckering at around about 6 weeks in your well-watered gardens, but only for neatness sake. Simply take the sucker and snap it off with a quick wrist action. Lay it down inside between the rows and let it add to God's blanket. Do your second top dressing when the maize just starts to show the tassel coming through the top of the funnel. Top dress with ammonium nitrate or urea, placing a 5 ml teaspoonful on the upslope side of plant stems. Use your hand or estimate 10 centimeters to place this fertilizer between the plant stems on the upslope side, just like that. Let it rain pollen down a little bit. These are the male flowers called tassels. They produce pollen, and those pollen grains fall from the top of the maize plant, and they make their way down to the female part of the flower, which is called the cob. Every one of the seeds inside the cob is connected to the outside world with a little silk. Absolutely beautiful, isn't it? One pollen grain will land on one silk at a time, and that pollen grain will grow inside the silk and eventually fertilize an individual seed. However, if you don't have God's blanket in place, you'll find that you often have 2/3 of your cob filled with seed and the balance is empty. Ever wondered why? Well, quite simply, these little silks, as it comes out to the latter part of the season, begin to dry out. And they will be the seeds that are in the front portion of your cob. So those dry silks, when the pollen grain falls on them, it can't actually grow inside them to fertilize that individual seed. That's why you only get seed full in the first 2/3 of the cob. Usually at around about 4 months, your maize plants are dying back. And for the first time since the canopy closed completely, with that dieback of leaves, you're getting light penetrating through the canopy. There's a little bit of residual moisture left over because of the conservation of that moisture with God's blanket. So you get a flush in late weeds like this. Now most farmers are too lazy and they end up going to harvest and their fields are a jungle of weeds with blackjacks and burrs sticking into them and buffalo beans that make them itch terribly. Harvest time is supposed to be a time of joy. Instead, the harvest becomes a misery. Do a fourth and late weed control like this, you'll be able to harvest with joy and be able to keep a weed-free stand throughout the winter season. It's amazing. With God's blanket in place, such a strong suppression of any weed germination. One of the great advantages to having 100% blanket coverage.
The promises, walk in it, shine bright, let your glory fill this land, faith, hope, you know that the blessings are coming, Jesus, you are the way, you are the way.
Harvest time is the most joyful time for farmers. We've already harvested many bags of beans from this garden and we've come to harvest the maize. Harvest when your maize is physiologically mature, usually 2 months after tasseling. The stalks will look very dry and the cobs will most probably be hanging down. The seeds will be well dented by this stage, glassy and too hard to scratch with your nail. At this stage, the maize is at about 30% moisture content. Harvest your cobs and store them in a safe, dry, sunny place around your house, on the rooftop or on a drying rack until they are properly dried out. The seeds will have no transparent sections in them when ready to store. That is at about 13% moisture content. Only then should the maize be shelled, dusted with chemicals and stored in bags. Let's take these cobs back to the lab to get a yield test of them. You know, on those terrible beach sands, our well-watered garden has now yield tested over 9 tons a hectare. We want to thank you, Lord. You're so amazing. What a blessing. Stalk borer is a terrible pest in maize, but we can control it if we understand its life cycle. It starts off as a pupa at the start of the season, then becomes a moth which lays eggs on the stems. These become little worms which bore through the stems, leaving their trademark breathing holes on the sides of the stalks. They then pupate after 27 days and the whole life cycle starts all over again. This cycle happens several times during the growing season of the maize plant. But at the end of the season, the pupa is formed at the crown of the plant, on the coolest, shady side at the soil surface. If we knock down the maize stalks, we expose the pupa to UV radiation and heat, and this dries them out. And along with the opportunistic feeding of other species such as ants, birds, and decomposing bacteria, we can significantly reduce stalk borer infestation. Interestingly enough, grazing alone has proven to be inadequate in the reduction of stalk borer incidence, as the crown is still left intact. This stresses the importance of not cutting or grazing down the stalks, but rather knocking them down completely. Knock the stalks down backwards by kicking them off at the crown, laying them neatly in the interrows. These stalks are a new blanket or mulch, so don't burn them and do your best to protect them from animals. We will plant into these maize stalks which would have decomposed quite significantly by next season. The next session, called 20 Reasons Why We Do the How, will take you on a discovery of why God's blanket has been proven to be our soil's greatest asset.